Access denied. The words appeared on the elevator screen with a soft chime, almost polite, almost routine, but in the quiet of the Northbridge Global headquarters, they landed like something far heavier. Ava Johnson stood alone in front of the glass doors of the executive elevator, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if she had expected the system itself to hesitate. Around her, the 42nd floor executive lobby continued its polished rhythm, soft footsteps on marble, muted conversations, the distant hum of a city that never paused. But something subtle had shifted. A security camera above the elevator blinked once, then twice, as if recalibrating. At the main desk, Richard Coleman glanced up from his tablet and frowned, noticing her for the first time not as a visitor, but as a disruption. "Ma'am," he said, voice controlled but firm, stepping closer with the practiced authority of someone used to controlling access rather than questioning it. "This floor is restricted. You need proper clearance to be here." Ava didn't respond immediately. Her eyes stayed on the elevator panel, where the word access denied remained frozen, like a decision the building itself had made. She wore no visible badge, no company lanyard, no sign of importance that anyone here would recognize at face value. Just a simple dark blazer, tailored but unbranded, and a calm that didn't match the subtle tension forming around her. Behind Richard, Sophie Grant straightened from the reception console, already uneasy, fingers hovering over the security alert button without pressing it. "Sir," she said quietly, "her name isn't in the guest registry for executive appointments." Richard didn't look at her. "Then she doesn't belong up here," he replied, voice tightening slightly as if the situation was already resolved in his mind. Ava finally turned her head just slightly, enough for her gaze to meet Richard's. "I'm expected upstairs," she said evenly, her voice neither raised nor defensive, simply factual. It should have ended there, but it didn't. Instead, Richard let out a short breath, almost a laugh, not unkind but dismissive, the kind of sound that closes doors faster than any. "Keycard. We get people trying this all the time," he said, gesturing faintly toward the elevator as if explaining policy rather than enforcing judgment. "Wrong floor, wrong assumption." At that moment, deep within the building's internal network, something flickered. A background system, silent, automated, rarely questioned, registered her name. Ava Johnson. A brief pause. A verification request. Then another. On a secondary terminal behind the reception wall, Mark Ellison, security lead, tilted his head as lines of data shifted unexpectedly across his screen. "That's strange," he muttered under his breath, not yet loud enough to interrupt the moment. The system hesitated again, not failing, not approving, simply uncertain. Ava didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't insist. She just stood there, as if waiting for something far beyond human permission. Richard, unaware of the subtle shift behind the scenes, stepped half a pace closer, lowering his voice slightly, as if trying to be reasonable. "Look, I don't know who told you had access today, but I'm going to need you to step away from the executive elevator." For the first time, Ava's expression changed, not in emotion, but in recognition. Not of him, of the system. Somewhere deep in the building's architecture, a dormant protocol blinked once, as if awakening to a name it had been designed never to forget. The silence that followed the elevator denial was not empty. It was measured, almost intentional, as if the building itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Ava Johnson remained in the same position, her gaze steady on the elevator panel where the words had not changed, access denied still glowing softly. Around her, the executive lobby resumed its surface-level motion, but the energy underneath had shifted in ways only a few people could sense. Richard Coleman exhaled slowly, trying to restore control over a moment that felt slightly off balance. He adjusted his suit jacket, stepping fully into the space between Ava and the elevator, reinforcing the invisible boundary that had just been established. "I am going to need you to understand something," he said carefully, his tone now more formal than before, as if formality itself could stabilize the situation. "This is not a public area. Executive access is strictly controlled by verified clearance. If there has been a mistake in scheduling, it needs to be resolved downstairs." Ava finally looked away from the elevator and met his eyes directly. There was no urgency in her expression, no frustration, only a quiet attention that made Richard briefly second-guess his certainty. Behind him, Sophie Grant leaned slightly toward her monitor again, refreshing the executive appointment system for the third time. Her brows tightened. The system showed no manual override, no scheduled executive visitor, nothing that justified the presence of the woman standing calmly at the restricted elevator bank. Yet something small had changed. A faint icon in the corner of her screen flickered from gray to a soft amber, then back again, as if the system itself was undecided about what it was seeing. "Sir," Sophie said again, more hesitant now, "the system is not fully confirming a denial. It is showing an incomplete classification." Richard did not turn around this time, but his voice lowered slightly. "Incomplete means not approved," he said, firm enough to close the interpretation. Mark Ellison, standing near the security access panel along the side wall, was no longer comfortable with what he was seeing. He stepped closer to the terminal, scrolling through back-end logs that were usually invisible to front desk personnel. Lines of data moved faster than expected, not alarming on their own, but inconsistent with standard traffic. "That is not normal," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Ava noticed the shift in his attention. Her eyes briefly moved toward him, acknowledging the screen, then returned to Richard. "I am not here by accident," she said calmly, each word precise, neither defensive nor emotional. Richard gave a small nod, as if acknowledging her belief rather than her reality. "I am sure you believe that," he replied, choosing his words carefully now. "But belief does not override access control." At that moment, the elevator panel emitted a soft tone again, not the same as before. A second line appeared beneath the original message, briefly visible before stabilizing. "System verification in progress." Sophie stepped back from her console slightly. "That should not be happening," she said quietly. Mark's expression tightened as he watched a separate line of authentication begin to populate on his screen without manual input. It did not indicate approval or denial. It simply indicated recognition. Ava remained still, her posture unchanged, but something subtle had shifted in her stillness. It was no longer patience. It was anticipation. Richard, noticing none of this fully, gestured once more toward the direction of the main elevators. "If you will come with me, we can resolve this properly," he said, his tone now attempting to reassert control. But the system behind him continued to change, quietly, independently, as if responding to a name the building had not expected to hear again. The faint system verification in progress message lingered on the elevator panel like a quiet interruption that no one in the executive lobby could fully ignore anymore. Ava Johnson remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if she had already seen this moment long before it unfolded. Richard Coleman, however, was beginning to feel the subtle shift in control that he could not name yet, but could definitely sense. The certainty he carried a few minutes earlier was no longer stable, replaced by a growing discomfort that crept in through small inconsistencies he could not dismiss as easily as before. Behind him, Sophie Grant stared at her monitor longer than she should have, her eyes tracking a line of data that had just updated without any manual request. "Sir," she said again, her voice lower now, "the system is not only verifying. It is cross-checking executive-level authorization history across multiple layers." Richard turned his head slightly, but did not fully engage. "It is still a denial until confirmed otherwise," he said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier sharpness. At the side security terminal, Mark Ellison was no longer scrolling. He was watching. The back-end interface had shifted again, and this time the change was not subtle. A classification field that should have remained static now displayed a label that had not been active in years. "Executive Owner Authority pending confirmation." Mark froze for a moment, his hand hovering over the keyboard without pressing anything. "That cannot be right," he whispered, but the system did not correct itself. Instead, it expanded the verification window, pulling historical clearance records that were not part of standard employee access. Richard finally noticed Mark's expression and stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked, now more direct. Mark hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. "The system is pulling executive ownership verification data," he said, "not just access credentials." Sophie stepped away from her console slightly, her attention now fully locked on the anomaly. That level of data is restricted to corporate governance, she added quietly. Richard's posture stiffened, but he tried to regain control of the narrative. Then it is clearly a system glitch, he said quickly, almost too quickly. Ava finally spoke again, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the tension without raising its volume. It is not a glitch, she said. The words were simple, but they landed differently this time. Not as a claim, but as a confirmation. At that exact moment, the elevator panel changed again. The soft chime returned, but this time the message was no longer ambiguous. Access protocol reevaluated. Executive floor clearance match found. Richard stared at the panel, his expression tightening as the words resolved fully. Sophie's breath caught slightly as her screen mirrored the same update. That is not possible, she said under her breath, though the system was clearly disagreeing with her. Mark took a slow step back from the terminal, as if physical distance might restore logic to what he was seeing. Ava did not move forward or backward. She simply waited. Then, for the first time, the building's internal assistant system activated through the overhead speakers, its voice calm, neutral, and precise. Identity confirmation recognized, it said. Welcome back, authorized executive owner. The words hung in the air without explanation, without apology, and without hesitation. Richard's face shifted slightly as he looked at Ava again, no longer seeing a visitor, but something he had not prepared for. Sophie slowly lowered her hand from the console, unsure whether to continue interacting with a system that had just contradicted every assumption they had made. Mark remained silent, his eyes still locked on the authorization log that had now stabilized under a single verified status line. Ava finally turned her head toward Richard, meeting his gaze fully. The space between them felt different now, not physically changed but structurally redefined. The system had already spoken, and it was no longer waiting for permission to be believed. The moment the system voice finished speaking, the executive lobby changed in a way that was not visible at first, but deeply felt by everyone standing inside it. The air itself seemed to lose its earlier certainty, replaced by a quiet tension that no longer came from confrontation but from recognition. Ava Johnson remained still for a brief moment, as if allowing the confirmation to settle into the space before she acknowledged it. Richard Coleman stood frozen in place, his earlier confidence completely eroded, replaced by a careful silence that he did not know how to break without making the situation worse. Sophie Grant slowly stepped back from her console, her eyes still locked on the screen where the executive status had fully stabilized into verified owner clearance, a status she had never seen activated in real time before. Mark Ellison exhaled sharply, not in relief but in disbelief, his hand hovering over the security terminal as if waiting for the system to reverse itself at any second, though it did not. Instead, every layer of the interface reinforced the same confirmation, each update more final than the last. Ava finally shifted her gaze from the elevator panel back to Richard, and when she spoke, her voice carried a calm that did not rise but still filled the space completely. "You said I did not belong here," she said, not as a question but as a reflection of what had already been recorded. Richard swallowed slightly, trying to regain composure, but the words he had prepared earlier no longer fit the reality in front of him. "There must have been a misunderstanding in the system," he said, though even he could hear the weakening structure of that explanation. Sophie looked up from her console, hesitant but unable to ignore what she was seeing. "There is no misunderstanding in the current authorization chain," she said quietly. "It is fully validated at the highest level." That sentence landed harder than anything spoken before it, because it removed the last remaining space for denial. Mark finally stepped forward slightly, his voice cautious but direct. "The executive floor access is not just cleared," he said. "It is recognized as primary ownership authority." The words shifted the room again, and now even the background sounds of the building felt distant, as if the system had pulled attention inward to this single point of confirmation. Ava did not react with surprise or satisfaction. Instead, she simply took one small step closer to the elevator panel and raised her hand slightly toward it. The system responded instantly, the interface changing without delay, replacing restricted access messages with full control options. Richard instinctively took a half step back, not out of fear, but out of the sudden realization that the structure he had been enforcing was not his to define. Ava glanced at him briefly, then at Sophie, then at Mark, as if acknowledging each role in the moment that had just unfolded. "Restore full executive floor protocols," she said calmly. There was no hesitation in the system response. "Confirmed," the system replied. Immediately, the elevator doors that had been locked in restriction earlier now opened smoothly, silently, as if they had been waiting for this exact instruction all along. Sophie's hands dropped from the console entirely, no longer attempting to intervene or interpret. Mark lowered his gaze to the terminal, where access logs now showed a complete reversal of control hierarchy, reassigning authority to the standing figure in front of him. Richard remained silent, his earlier certainty now replaced by the uncomfortable clarity of what had just changed. Ava stepped forward toward the open elevator, but before entering, she paused and turned slightly back toward the room. Her voice remained steady, neither raised nor softened, simply final in its clarity. "Access was never the issue," she said. "Recognition was." And with that, the system behind her confirmed her presence once more, not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as the origin point of every authorization now active in the building. The elevator doors remained open longer than they should have, as if the building itself was waiting for confirmation that no one in the room dared to challenge. Ava Johnson stood at the threshold, not rushing forward, not hesitating, simply present in a way that made the space around her feel redefined. The executive lobby behind her was no longer operating under the same assumptions it had held just minutes earlier. Richard Coleman remained where he had stopped, his posture no longer assertive but carefully restrained, as if any movement might misrepresent his position in the unfolding hierarchy. Sophie Grant stood near her console, hands lowered now, watching the system screen stabilize into a unified executive ownership status that left no room for reinterpretation. Mark Ellison had stepped slightly away from the security terminal, his eyes no longer focused on input commands, but on the finality of output that the system had already confirmed. Ava finally stepped fully into the elevator, and as she did, the interior lighting adjusted automatically, shifting from standard executive access tone to full priority recognition. The doors did not wait for a manual command to close. They responded to her presence alone. Before they fully shut, Richard took a small step forward, his voice breaking the silence carefully. "There must have been an error in communication somewhere," he said, though the sentence no longer carried the authority it once did. Ava looked at him through the narrowing gap of the elevator doors, her expression steady and unreadable. "There was no error," she replied calmly. "Only assumption." The doors closed completely, sealing the conversation outside the elevator space. For a moment, the executive lobby did not move. No one spoke. Even the ambient sound of the building seemed subdued, as if recalibrating its own understanding of what had just occurred. Then, without warning, the security terminal behind Mark emitted a soft confirmation tone. He turned back slowly, watching as the system began executing a sequence labeled Executive Authority Normalization Protocol. One by one, access privileges across the executive floor began to update. Richard's identification badge, which had previously held floor control permissions, flashed briefly before losing executive override capability. Sophie watched it happen on her screen in real time, her expression shifting from confusion to recognition that the structure she had relied on was no longer valid. Mark's terminal displayed a final message. "All executive floor access has been reassigned TO, primary owner authority." Richard stared at the notification, his jaw tightening slightly, not in anger but in realization. The authority he had enforced moments earlier had not been challenged by force or argument, but simply overwritten by something that existed beyond his control. Sophie finally spoke, her voice quiet but precise. "We have been operating under a delegated layer," she said. "It was never the top level." Mark nodded slowly, as if accepting something he had not previously allowed himself to consider. "We were responding to permission," he added, "not ownership." Inside the elevator, Ava stood still as it began its ascent, the movement smooth and silent, carrying her upward without interruption. The display panel inside no longer showed restricted floors or conditional access. It showed direct routing to executive command level without request confirmation. Ava did not look at it. Her attention remained forward, focused not on the building's reaction, but on what had already been in place long before any of them realized it. The system had not changed because she arrived. It had simply stopped ignoring what was already true. The elevator continued its silent ascent, moving through the executive tower with a precision that felt less mechanical and more intentional, as if the building itself was now aligned with a different understanding of authority. Ava Johnson stood still inside the cabin, her presence unchanged, her attention focused forward while the floor indicator steadily climbed toward the highest command level. Outside, the executive floor had already begun to destabilize in subtle but undeniable ways. Richard Coleman remained in the same position where the elevator doors had closed, but his authority in the space around him no longer produced the same response from the system. Security panels that once reacted instantly to his input now required secondary verification, and every attempt to access executive controls returned a standardized message confirming that privileges had been reassigned. Sophie Grant watched her monitor as new system directives populated in real time, each one more absolute than the last. Executive governance layer has been centralized, she read quietly, her voice carrying a disbelief she could not fully suppress. Mark Ellison leaned closer to the security interface, scanning through logs that now displayed a complete restructuring of access hierarchy. "It is not just a temporary override," he said slowly. "It is a full ownership reallocation protocol." Richard finally turned toward them, his expression tight with controlled uncertainty. "There has to be a reversal trigger," he said, though the confidence behind the statement was no longer present. Sophie shook her head slightly. "There is none listed in the current active system state," she replied. Meanwhile, inside the elevator, Ava received a subtle notification on the internal display. Command level access confirmed. No additional authorization required. She did not react outwardly, but the elevator's pace adjusted slightly as it neared its destination, slowing not due to malfunction, but due to protocol alignment. The doors opened smoothly onto a floor that was different from the executive level below, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The command level was quiet, almost untouched, reserved for decisions that shaped everything beneath it. As Ava stepped out, the lighting adjusted automatically to a warmer, more neutral tone, and every sensor in the corridor registered her presence without delay or question. At the far end of the hallway, a secondary control hub activated. Screens that had remained dormant for weeks lit up one by one, displaying global operational status across Northbridge Global Holdings. In a separate part of the building, Richard's access badge emitted a final soft signal before fully deactivating executive clearance, leaving him with only standard employee status. Sophie's terminal followed a similar transition, her access narrowing to observational permissions only. Mark's screen, however, displayed something different. A single line of instruction appeared across the interface: "Stand by for executive directive." No explanation followed. No timeline was provided. Only acknowledgement that authority had shifted beyond the layer they previously believed they were operating under. Ava continued walking down the corridor, her footsteps quiet against the polished surface, each step triggering subtle system responses that aligned environmental settings ahead of her path. Doors unlocked before she reached them, not opening in reaction, but in anticipation. At the end of the corridor, a sealed command suite awaited, its interface glowing faintly with recognition protocols already active. Ava paused only briefly before placing her hand near the access panel. The system responded instantly, confirming identity without request, and the doors to the command suite unlocked completely. Behind her, far below on the executive floor, the team that had once controlled access to everything stood in silence, now fully aware that what they had been enforcing was never control at all, but only permission waiting to be reclaimed. Inside the command suite, the air was noticeably different, not in temperature or sound, but in structure, as if the room itself had been waiting for a specific presence to define its purpose again. Ava Johnson stepped fully inside, and the doors sealed behind her without hesitation, locking into place with a soft confirmation tone that carried no sense of restriction, only completion. The space in front of her illuminated gradually, revealing a wide operational interface that spanned across multiple curved displays embedded into the architecture of the room. Each screen activated in sequence, responding not to a manual command, but to her proximity alone. Across the executive tower below, the shift was becoming impossible to ignore. Systems that had once operated independently were now synchronizing under a single directive layer, and every subordinate access point was quietly adjusting itself to reflect the new hierarchy. Richard Coleman stood in the executive lobby with his hands lowered, no longer attempting to intervene, his attention fixed on the nearest security monitor that now displayed restricted access across multiple zones he had controlled only minutes earlier. Sophie Grant remained silent, her eyes scanning a cascade of system updates that were arriving faster than she could interpret them, each line confirming the same restructuring event without deviation. Mark Ellison was the first to speak, though his voice carried less certainty than before. "The command level is fully active," he said, almost carefully, as if speaking too loudly might destabilize the confirmation on screen. Richard turned slightly toward him. "Define active," he asked, though the question felt more like hesitation than command. Mark paused briefly before answering. "It is executing autonomous governance protocol," he said. "All executive-level permissions are now subordinate to command authority." At that exact moment, every screen in the executive lobby updated simultaneously, displaying the same message across all terminals. Global access restructure complete. Command authority engaged. Sophie took a slow step back from her console, her hands no longer interacting with the system. "We are no longer managing access," she said quietly. "We are being managed by it." Richard did not respond immediately. His focus shifted to the realization that everything he had enforced earlier was never independent authority, but delegated control layered over something far more foundational. Meanwhile, inside the command suite, Ava moved closer to the central interface. As she approached, the system projected a live structural map of the entire Northbridge global network, not as isolated departments or regions, but as a unified operational body. Nodes across the map began to illuminate one by one, each confirming synchronization with the command layer she now stood within. A soft system voice activated again, more refined than before. "Executive governance has been fully normalized under primary ownership directive," it stated. Ava observed the display without interruption, her expression unchanged, as if the confirmation was not news but completion of a process already in motion long before she arrived. Back in the executive lobby, Mark noticed something else changing. Security restrictions were no longer being enforced manually or through local control. They were being overridden at the infrastructure level. "Even local overrides are being disabled," he said, his voice lower now. Richard finally looked away from the screen, his attention shifting to the physical space around him, which now felt less like a controlled environment and more like a monitored one. Sophie's voice followed, quieter still. "Every access point is now reporting to a single command authority," she said. "There are no exceptions." The reality settled across the room without announcement. No alarms sounded. No disruptions occurred. Instead, everything simply aligned. Inside the command suite, Ava extended her hand toward the central control interface. As her fingers hovered near the activation field, the system responded instantly, expanding the operational view across global networks, awaiting only her final directive. Behind her, the doors remained closed, not as a barrier, but as confirmation that the transition was complete and irreversible. Across the Northbridge global headquarters, the shift in control was no longer something that could be interpreted as a system update or technical anomaly. It had become a structural reality that was quietly rewriting every layer of authority in real time. In the executive lobby, Richard Coleman stood motionless as his access panel finally went dark, leaving only standard identification privileges active. Sophie Grant looked at her console, where every executive command field had been replaced with a single unified status line, indicating that governance had been transferred beyond her operational level. Mark Ellison remained near the security terminal, watching as global access nodes across the system synchronized into a single command hierarchy that no longer responded to localized input. None of them spoke at first, not because they did not understand what was happening, but because the speed of the transition had removed the space where disagreement usually existed. Inside the command suite on the upper level, Ava Johnson stood before the central interface, which now displayed full global operational visibility across Northbridge systems. Every region, every department, Every executive branch was represented as a connected structure under a single active authority. The system voice activated again, calm and precise. All subordinate governance layers have been fully integrated, it stated. No conflicting authority detected. Ava did not respond immediately. Her attention moved across the interface, reading the stability of the system as it settled into its final configuration. The building itself, once divided into layers of access and restriction, now functioned as a unified network under one directive source. Below her, in the executive lobby, Richard finally broke the silence. "So it is done," he said quietly, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of something he could no longer reverse or reinterpret. Sophie nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on the terminal. "There is no rollback function visible," she confirmed. Mark added after a moment. "All legacy access structures have been archived and locked." The words carried finality, not urgency. Across the building, doors that once required layered authentication now responded instantly to a single authority signal. Security protocols that had defined hierarchy moments earlier were now simplified into compliance status indicators. Ava raised her hand slightly toward the central interface, and the system responded by expanding its global operational map further, revealing full enterprise-scale alignment across continents. The voice returned once more. "Primary directive authority is now fully active. Awaiting executive confirmation for operational governance distribution." Ava paused briefly, her expression unchanged, then spoke with calm clarity. "Stabilize all systems under continuous monitoring," she said. The system confirmed instantly. Confirmed. At that moment, every screen across the Northbridge network updated simultaneously, reflecting a single stable command state. In the executive lobby far below, Richard's screen displayed the same update, followed by a final message indicating that all prior executive control privileges had been permanently retired. Sophie stepped back from her console completely, no longer interacting with it, while Mark lowered his hands from the security terminal, acknowledging that no further input would alter the outcome. The structure of authority that had once governed every action inside the building had fully collapsed into a single unified command source. Inside the command suite, Ava remained still as the system completed its final synchronization cycle. The interface dimmed slightly, not due to loss of power, but due to stabilization. The building was no longer adjusting to change. It had finished recognizing where control had always belonged. The final stabilization message remained across every interface of Northbridge Global Systems, not as an alert, not as a warning, but as a confirmation that the structure of control had reached its final state. Inside the command suite, Ava Johnson stood before the central interface as the glow of global synchronization slowly settled into a steady, uninterrupted state. The system no longer requested input in fragmented layers. It now operated under a unified directive model that responded only to her presence. Across the building below, the executive lobby had fallen into a quiet stillness that felt different from confusion or shock. It was recognition without resistance. Richard Coleman remained standing near the security terminal, but his posture had changed completely. The authority he had once projected through procedure and access control no longer had any functional weight. His screen now displayed a single line indicating that his executive privileges had been permanently dissolved. Under global governance realignment, Sophie Grant stood beside him, no longer attempting to refresh or recheck the system. She had already accepted what the interface repeatedly confirmed. All previous control structures had been absorbed into a higher level of command. Mark Ellison remained silent, his focus shifting between the terminal and the realization that every decision point he once managed had been reduced to observation status only. None of them were being removed or punished. They were simply no longer the source of control. Above them, Ava finally turned slightly from the central interface, her reflection visible across the glass display that now showed global operations fully aligned under a single authority layer. The system voice activated one final time, calm and precise. All Northbridge Global Systems are now operating under primary executive ownership protocol. No conflicts detected. No additional authorization required. Ava paused for a moment, as if confirming the completeness of that statement not from the system, but from her own understanding. Then she spoke once, clearly and without emphasis. Maintain continuous operation. No disruption cycles. The system responded instantly. Confirmed. Continuous operation engaged. Across continents, data centers, executive floors, and regional command nodes reflected the same unified status. The organization no longer functioned through layers of approval or delegation. It functioned through a single, uninterrupted directive source. Back in the executive lobby, Richard finally looked down at his access badge, now reduced to standard identification with no executive linkage remaining. Sophie turned off her console, not because it failed, but because there was nothing left to verify. Mark stepped away from the security terminal entirely, his role in the system now limited to observation of a structure he no longer influenced. None of them spoke further. There was nothing left in the system to argue with, override, or interpret. Inside the command suite, Ava remained still as the interface dimmed into a stable operational glow. The building, once divided into authority, restriction, and hierarchy, now existed as a single continuous system aligned under one recognized source of control. No announcement followed. No celebration.